that the Northeast India comprises mainly of the Seven Sisters and Sikkim. And it covers around 8% of total geographical area of the country, and its population percentage is about 4%. The first thing which actually strikes us whenever we think about the Northeast India is its diversity with respect to biological diversity and both ethnic diversity. As we all know, Northeast India consists of one of the 35 biological hotspots or biodiversity hotspots and 220 ethnic groups. There is indicative and gathering evidence of climatic variability and instability with a global rise in the frequency and intensity of extreme events such as floods and landslides. Northeast region is highly vulnerable to changing trends of climate because of certain specific reasons, such as its fragile ecosystems, technically very active geological settings, very powerful hydrological and monsoon regime, location in the eastern Himalayan periphery, and last, economic underdevelopment. Floods and landslides are a recurrent problem in many parts of Northeast India. Almost every year, large areas come under the grip of floods, causing extensive damage to lives and properties, thereby increasing vulnerability and decreasing coping capability of the people, both in rural and urban areas. Landslides are also on the rise due to rainfall trigger and geological conditions in steep slopes. In context of these, the panel aims to discuss various issues related to disaster management in Northeast India. So we have in our panel three distinguished guests. Dr. Anamika Barua, she's an associate professor in IIT Guwahati. Dr. Surajit Sarkar from Center for Community Knowledge, AUD, and Ms. Sunanda De, she is working in the SAG Disaster Management Center. So may I take this opportunity to invite Dr. Barua to start her presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Das. I would start by thanking the organizers for two reasons. One is, of course, inviting me here, and also to be able to, put up a panel, a special panel on the Northeast, that also in the center, which is also very important. Usually we conduct these kind of workshops and conferences in IIT Guwahati, and we have to invite the center to the state. So it was good to see that the state has been asked to come and represent here in the central, in the center. My presentation, I don't have a PPT. So my presentation is basically on a paper that we had worked together with Buet in Bangladesh, actually, because I think you all are aware that River Brahmaputra flows through Assam, goes to Bangladesh, and it joins Bay of Bengal. So what we were trying to understand in this study, which was funded by IUCN, is how people are adapting or coping to the changes, or I would say natural disaster. Flood was one of the main focus, and also erosion. We wanted to see how these two countries are actually coping. How, is there any similarity or dissimilarity? But because there will not be so much time for me to talk about both the countries, so I'm going to only focus on Assam. I'm not going to go too deep into the case studies and give you all the details, how we collected data, so on and so forth, but I can of course answer your questions if you have any. My focus of the presentation is mostly to look into the kind of interventions that has happened in the flood affected areas, and the interventions which are mostly structural in nature hasn't been able to actually solve a lot of problems that people face during the time of flood, even after. And so what I'm trying to focus in my presentation mostly is I'm looking at it more from a development poverty perspective, and I'm trying to bring in who actually we are talking about, who are vulnerable, and they are vulnerable to what. That is what the idea is, with special emphasis on the natural disasters like flood and erosion. So I will start with a larger focus, where I would like to start my presentation with climate change and natural disasters as a whole. So, when we talk about climate change, the first question that I always face in most of the panel and most of the discussions meeting is that, is it climate change or is it climate variability? And for my presentation, I would like to keep it as climate variability, because for states like Assam, we really do not have enough data to actually say that climate has changed. So what we usually refer to, and even in our report to IUCN, we mention it as climate variation, and how these variations in terms of changes in the rainfall pattern, changes in temperature that we could see in the last 10 to 20 years has made changes in the frequency of the occurrence of these natural events, mostly flood. Before I go to the case of Assam, before I tell you the story of Assam, let me just tell you that natural disasters as such is something which is not unnatural. That is why we call it natural. It becomes a problem and it becomes unnatural when human try to make, does some kind of activities or some kind of interference which disturbs the natural process. So one thing that I remember when I went for field work to a small river, I think you may have heard of this river island called Majuli. You've heard? So it's one of the largest river islands of Asia. So in Majuli, when I went to do a field work, and I asked this farmer that, can you tell us, like, what is your, how do you look at flood? Do you think it's good, it's bad, or is it having an impact? He actually got annoyed, and he said that don't talk about flood, because this year we didn't get any flood at all. And he said that, for us, it's not bad because it comes with a lot of things. When the flood comes, it comes with fertile soil, rich soil. So it helps us to cultivate better and more. But the problem is not the flood comes. The problem is that flood stays too long. When we want it to go, it's not going. So that's where the problem is. And he also used a very interesting term. And he said that, we call it dancing with water. So we dance with water. When the flood comes, we dance with water and the flood goes. We have festival during that time too because we can't do much. We have to sit at home. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that it's not always bad for these kind of natural events. If I don't call it disaster and if I call it event, then it's nothing wrong for these natural events to come and go. But it becomes a problem when it doesn't go, one, and when the frequency increases. When you don't get enough time to recover from your last event, it's like celebrating a festival every year, every month. It's something like that, which is not good for anybody. So for them, that is the problem. Now, what is happening in most of the cases that we see, again, in the case of even not only confined to Assam, for states like Bihar, Orissa, what you see is that the frequency of occurrence of flood has increased and the time period have changed. So now what is required at the time is some kind of an adaptation where people can adapt to these changes. People can successfully adapt to these changes. Now here I want to make a strong distinction between coping and adaptation. Coping is not adaptation. Coping is something where you are just trying to cope with the change. If there is a possibility that once you cope, when the next event happens, you have no resources to cope with the next event at all. So you are basically becoming more and more vulnerable. So emphasis should be how will they adapt? How will they adapt to these new kind of phenomena that's happening due to the changes or due to the variation in climate? And I'm sure you are also aware that most of the policy responses to climate change are dominated by mitigation. But while mitigation is very important, both mitigation and adaptation needs to go hand in hand, but mitigation's impact you get to see, it's a long-term phenomena. It takes longer time to see the impact, but the short and the medium-term impacts needs to be taken care of by adaptation. The need for adaptation, again, becomes very important for those regions, those areas, for those sections of the society who are already at the edge of their coping ranges. And there is, again, a possibility that these communities from large number of years, they are coping with the changes. But the phenomena that they come across now, because when flood used to come and the way flood comes now is a lot of difference. So they are not able to cope with the knowledge, the indigenous knowledge that they have. And so what they need is some kind of an external help to be able to successfully come out of these kind of impacts, the kind of, the recovery that needs to be there in place. So therefore, there is an urgent need, first of all, to understand the level of vulnerability that they face and the kind of adaptive response that needs to be developed so that they can have a sustainable future. Adaptation to climate change is dependent on the current adaptive capacity and the development part of the developing countries. Now, in most of my work, I keep saying that, you can't really talk about adaptation and you don't talk about development, you don't talk about poverty. Because in most of the time, we keep saying that, developing countries are more vulnerable than developed countries. Why do we say that? It's simply because, we do not have the capacity to adapt. Similarly, within developing country, we say the regions like Orissa, Bihar, Assam, or the entire Northeast is much more vulnerable than any other states of the country. Why? Again, because poverty levels are high, the capacity to adapt is low, and as such, they are vulnerable, and the resilience to any change, any kind of disaster is very low. So this is where the whole issue of can we mainstream the climate change adaptation into the development policies of the region or state. For example, for state like Assam, which also have this whole problem of economic backwardness, is this also a cause that so much of lives and livelihood gets affected even if there is one small kind of an event that happens. For example, you are all aware of the earthquake that happened in Sikkim. People are still trying to get out of it. I mean, it is still taking them so much time. If you go to the field and you talk to people, they still refer to the earthquake. They say it will take them another 20 years to go back to what they had, that they have lost everything for that earthquake. Okay, now I'll just quickly come to, this is a brief background about what happens when an event happens, what happens when you do not have capacity to adapt, and more so when there is uncertainty. We call it now wicked environment. We really do not know what is going to happen tomorrow. There's so much of uncertainty. Although we have a lot of future predictions coming up, climate models coming up, I'm sure you are aware that all these predictions are done on keeping in mind a lot of assumptions. And the climate scientists themselves say that there is a lot of uncertainty to what we are predicting. It could be more, it could be less. So in such a circumstances, how people would actually prepare themselves for anything that may happen in the future. So should we go for short-term interventions, like help them to recover from these events that happens once it strikes them, or we should be more prepared so that even if this event happens, they're still able to take care of it on their own before the external aid or any external intervention happens. So coming to the Northeast, I think Dr. Das has already very clearly told you that it's a very diverse region. So I cannot actually talk about the Northeast. I can only talk about one particular state, which is Assam. The landscape of Assam itself is extremely vulnerable. So what I want to tell you here is that there are two things. One is physical vulnerability and another is social vulnerability. Unfortunately, Assam falls into both. If you look at the physical vulnerability in terms of its locations, the geology, the connectivity, it is completely isolated in many aspects. So it has already an inherent physical vulnerability, which is natural, which we immediately cannot make any change. But when you look at the social vulnerability, which is mostly reflected by the socio-economic characteristics of the region, Assam, again, is highly socially vulnerable because of high rates of poverty, because of lack of opportunities, poor connectivity, poor infrastructure. For all these factors, the region remains highly vulnerable, and you would see a lot of young people, because there are hardly any employment opportunities available, hardly any options available for them. They usually leave the state at a very early age of their career, and they prefer to stay outside the states. Now, many of them are able to do that because they have the options to do so. But many who do not have the options to do so have been living there and are not able to actually do otherwise what they could have done. So I'm trying to focus on the communities, rural communities mostly, who are in that kind of a state. And so what kind of interventions that has happened, are these interventions enough for them to be able to, or I would say, is it enough to build their resilience to these changes or these natural disasters that we come across? One more problem that I have seen in Assam is that when you talk about disaster, we have some data available. For example, according to State Disaster Management Authority, Assam has 5% of landmass is vulnerable to flood, 8% to cyclone, 55% to earthquake, and 70% of the land under cultivation is vulnerable to drought. So it's not flood, there are various other disasters which happens, and it is highly vulnerable to all these disasters, and so physically vulnerable. The Brahmaputra River, which is the 4th largest in the world, it carries 82% of the annual flow during the rainy season, which is mostly in the months of May to October. And Brahmaputra and one of its tributaries, which is called Barak, along with the other tributaries, are mostly responsible for the severe flood that happens almost every year, and now it happens, in fact, twice a year. So what happens usually when the flood happens? These are some of the statistics. This in turn causes a lot of economic losses in terms of damage to houses, public utilities, livestock, and crops. According to Assam Economic Survey 2011-12, these rivers have eroded 3.86 lakh hectares, which is around 7% of the total area of Assam since 1954. And around 4.75 lakh hectare and 0.94 lakh hectare area of Assam are flood-prone and drought-prone, respectively. Now, it of course falls under the seismic zone 5. Now, keeping these in mind, as I mentioned just now, unfortunately, the story doesn't end here, because if this was the only case, if Assam is physically vulnerable, then fine, because, we'll be able to find out ways to, help people to be able to cope with this vulnerability. But the problem is that it has a huge amount of social vulnerability, as I have just mentioned to you. And the social vulnerability are mostly reflected from socioeconomic as well as the demographic factors, and which keeps people's capacity to adapt really, really low. They are just not able to even adapt to the first attack of the flood. Forget about the prolonged attack. They are not even able to come out of it immediately when a shock happens. So the disasters have been affecting the lives and the livelihood of people of Assam since long time, and affected people have been coping with the risks and vulnerability caused by those with their indigenous knowledge, skills, and technologies, or traditional coping mechanisms. Although for generations they have used a variety of coping strategies to respond to environmental stresses, but repeated disasters has increased their poverty and deprivation. And therefore, many future climatic changes which are still unknown and uncertain could be beyond the past experiences of these communities. The impact of such environmental shocks can be horrifying for the region, as they are both physically as well as socioeconomically vulnerable. One another point that I have observed when we go to the field is that the women are the worst affected. Interestingly, there's been a lot of early warning system that has come up. Now, this wouldn't be correct if I say that this Assam State Disaster Authority hasn't done anything. There has been a lot of intervention made, but the focus so far has been mostly on recovery rather than preparedness. So what happens is that we keep everything ready for the flood to happen, and when the flood happens, because that you can't stop, and because the flood in Assam is not caused only because, and it is within the periphery of Assam. It happens from Arunachal, so it's very difficult actually to stop the flood from happening. But the problem is that so we haven't prepared the community enough that they can actually, can cope with this flood which they are sure is going to happen. You know what I'm trying to say? It's something that you know is going to happen, but you still do not have enough resources, enough assets in your hand that you can take care of that flood. So because even I live in Guwahati city, and even flood happens in Guwahati, but I don't get disrupted the way they get disrupted. That's a simple example, let me tell you. So when flood happens, there has been a lot of early warning systems that at the community level that has been now installed through various NGOs. Unfortunately, what we realize is that the person in the household who gets to know about the flood is coming, last person to know is the women, because they are mostly in the house. The men gets to know, they finish up their work, they come rushing home, but women gets to know at the end. And even for a women-headed household, we found that was the biggest problem. There was a very a sad picture that came up sometime back in one of the newspapers, that this woman who was drowned by the flood, and she was carrying her baby. She died and her baby was still in her hand, and they could not take the baby out because it was in her clutches, because she couldn't actually, by the time she got to know the flood is coming, she couldn't run out, and she just decided to stay at home with her baby in her hand. So these were some of the things that you get to see when you go to the field, you talk to the people, why is this happening? Now, coming to the institution part, a lot of money has been invested in terms of non-structural measures that has been taken to stop this flood. Now, this is where the mitigation part comes in. A large amount of work has been able to help too from these floods to, flood, not exactly flood to stop, but to divert the flood. So it doesn't happen in the area where there is a lot of people, where there is a lot of inhabitants. It goes to another direction. But many a times it fails, and when it fails, it is a bigger disaster, because people are under the assumption that this is not going to come this year, but it fails, it happens, and it comes back. So the study that we did, we realized we did a lot of household survey and all kind of understanding that we got. We found that the socio-economic factors makes them highly vulnerable, which is usually not taken into account. For example, river islands like Majuli, there is hardly any connectivity. If you have visited Majuli, you would see there are ferries which connects Jorhat, which is the district headquarters, to Majuli, and there are only 4 ferries which takes people up and down. So many people die, pregnant women delivers on the ferry and gives up their life. So all these connectivity, even if some kind of disaster happens, for them to reach to a safer place is absolutely not there. There is hardly any arrangement made, except they are given shelter to the relief areas which are slightly far off from the river. Apart from that, if you look at the economic conditions of the people, so I asked one of the farmers and I asked him, so this is where you say, we went to his house and we sat, we had tea and all, and we asked him, so what do you want your future to be? He said, my future is done, I'm going to stay here forever, but I want to see a better future for my son. So I asked, so why you don't want him to do what you are doing? His answer was no. But before he said no, he said, if I had a choice. He said, if I had a choice, my answer is no. I don't have a problem if he becomes a farmer, but I don't want him to be a farmer like me, who has to think about food every next day, who has to worry about the disasters, who has to think about whether I'm going to feed my family tomorrow or not. So he said, what we as a community want is a lot of other interventions apart from the recovery that we are getting to see now. That you come here, you give us money, you give us food grain, you tell us, okay, we are helping you to get out of what you had gone through. But the question is, can we ever not go through that process at all? Is it possible for us to be capable of take care of our family, our livelihood, that we don't get disrupted at all? And he said, I don't see that in the near future. So I just don't want my son or my daughter to go through all this that I'm going through, but I have no choice. So the point is, which I also discussed with the earlier panel, it is all about the freedom that we provide to a community or a person, to what extent he or she can actually choose or decide what he or she wants to do with his or her life. And I think that is something which needs to be looked at from a development perspective. If we are only focusing on things like flood, erosion, in a very ad hoc manner, we are basically going to come across these problems every year, and we spend more money in recovery process than preparing them. While the measures like providing them with better education, better health care, better sanitation facility, which looks to be very difficult, and many of you might be thinking that how is it related to flood? But it is so much related. Because once you can make them capable of taking care of themselves, all that you are spending to take them out of these disasters is not required. So that is where the mainstreaming climate change adaptation against any kind of natural disaster comes in. And this is where our study was focusing. And at the end of the day, we kind of suggested that while it is important that we take care of the present, what is happening, so there has to be some investments to ensure that they don't die, they live, but simultaneously with the short-term interventions that we are doing, we need to focus on long-term interventions. For example, providing livelihood opportunities, access to basic facilities like market, education, sanitation, healthcare, etc. So these complementary measures, although long-term in nature, are more effective in enhancing resilience by reducing poverty in the region. Hence, any intervention to reduce vulnerability to climate change, whether it's in Assam or any part of the country, should be such that the ultimate goal is poverty alleviation, so that communities' inherent capacity to withstand the impacts of climate change is enhanced, and they will always be able to depend, they don't have to depend on external agencies for coming out of this disaster. One last point I want to make is that when I say poverty, I'm not talking about income poverty. And this is a very, very narrow way of looking at poverty. These people do not really need money. They are self-sufficient. They have their land, they are producing food, and they're eating, except landless people. And Assam, I'm not sure how many of you are aware, now the situation have changed. There was not so much hunger in that state. People were able to live their life cultivating whatever they were eating. They were not extremely rich, neither they were extremely poor. So there was no extreme cases. But of course, situations have changed now. So the poverty that I'm trying to focus here is the multidimensional poverty, which is much beyond income poverty, which is where the other factors comes in about education, health, sanitation, access to resources, access to information, political freedom, all these things comes in. So I think this is what a larger focus should be, and this is what we are actually now trying to work with the government of Assam, that while your structural implementation continues and carries on, let us also start focusing on these non-structural implementation or non-structural interventions, which has to move simultaneously with the flood-affected community. Thank you.